It's a sad day. No, really it is. Guys, this will be my last ever Writer's Effect video. Well, slightly hyperbolic until the next syllabus kicks in. Hey, what's up guys, and welcome back to IGCSE Success, your one-stop shop for everything IGCSE English. Rightio, exams are just around the corner, and yes, I know there are an awful lot of Writer's Effect videos on my channel, but let me be as emphatic and as clear as possible. Nothing is going to top this one. So welcome to the final push course, starting with question 2D, the Writer's Effect question. And just a little preface to this video, this is not a sit down and watch passively kind of video. This is a free course that teaches you everything. Yes, I said everything you need to know about the Writer's Effect question. Perfect for those wanting to sharpen their skills, those aiming for top marks, or those who simply feel like they know absolutely nothing, because this starts from the ground up. Absolutely no fluff, no filler, everything is purposeful, I promise you. Just the stuff Cambridge wants to see. Now there are 4 modules, each focus on a different skill. So with that said, grab your notebook, your pen, your highlighters. You ready? Of course you are, let's go. Okay, here we go. Welcome to the final push. So I guess it's important to strip this question right back and rebuild it bit by bit so that by exam day, fingers crossed, you know exactly what Cambridge is looking for, and more importantly, how to give it to them. As I often say to my students, you don't want a, I guess, superficial, I think I kind of get it for any of the questions. You want a really assured, I'm absolutely going to smash this question level of confidence. Now, this is not about vague advice like you just need to analyze language more, you just need to zoom in more, because let's be honest, that helps absolutely nobody. So instead, each day it has a very clear focus. So assuming you're going to space them out day by day, on day 1, we are starting with the nuts and bolts. So looking closely at what language analysis actually is and what the question is really asking you to do. Then on day 2, we'll get into the good stuff, unpicking powerful images and learning how to zoom in on words and phrases properly, rather than just falling into that trap, I guess, of feature spotting different techniques and hoping for the best. Now on day 3, I'll show you exactly how to structure your response so it feels organized, it feels clear and examiner friendly. And then day 4 is where we'll, I guess, bring all this together and look at what real success actually looks like, what separate a basic response from one that pushes those to the top bands. And let's be honest, that's what we're all aiming for, right? Now, the key thing I want you to remember is this: 4 focus days can make a huge difference, not just to English, to any subject. So whether you complete 1 module each day like a sensible person, or decide to binge the whole thing in one sitting because panic has kicked in, absolutely no judgment by the way, by the end you'll have everything, I promise you, you'll have everything you need to approach the Writer's Effect question with confidence. Right, with that said and done, let's get into day 1. Okay, so day 1, let's start with the absolute nuts and bolts. Now, before we even start thinking about smashing the Writer's Effect question, we need to be crystal clear on what language analysis actually is, because this is where so many students go wrong. A lot of students, I guess, stay at that surface level, which is definitely what we don't want. They read a phrase, spot a technique, maybe say something like, this is a metaphor, or this creates imagery, and then stop there. Now, language analysis is about going beyond what simply is there on the page. It's not just about telling the examiner what the writer has done. It's about unpicking why they have done it and what effect it creates in the mind of the reader. That word why is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Think of it like this. Anyone can spot the puzzle pieces, right? You can say that's an adjective, that's a simile, that's a powerful verb, absolutely lovely. But Cambridge is not handing out top marks for, I guess, a glorified spotting game. What they really want is for you to put those pieces together and explain the bigger picture. why the writer has chosen that word and not another one or phrase, or why they have chosen to use that image, and most importantly, what does it make the reader picture, feel, or understand? That is language analysis. So instead of just saying the writer uses the word shattered, for example, we need to move into why shattered. What does that suggest? Something broken, something violent, something sudden, something impossible to repair. What image does this build? What atmosphere does it create? And that movement from what to why is exactly what the question is all about. And honestly, once you understand that, this question becomes so much less intimidating. It stops being about finding fancy techniques and starts being about explaining meaning and effect. So now that we know what language analysis actually means, let's look at what the question itself is asking you to do, because honestly, half of the battle is reading this properly. And I know that sounds really obvious, but you would be amazed at how many students lose marks before they've even started writing. The first thing, and this is absolutely non-negotiable, is reread the correct paragraphs, not the paragraph before, not the one after, because it looks more interesting. The exact paragraphs the question gives you. Now, Cambridge is very specific here, and your analysis has to be anchored in those sections. Now, one of the most important clues is the information after the ellipsis, which often is ignored. This part is, it really is gold, guys. It tells you what each paragraph is broadly about, and this should shape your analysis. For example, if it says the paragraph is about a character's feelings ahead of the run, then your analysis needs to stay rooted in that idea. So when you zoom in on language, you are constantly linking back to fear, anticipation, nerves, excitement, etc., whatever the focus is on. Likewise, if the second paragraph is about the natural landscape, then your analysis needs to stay anchored to the image of the setting and the atmosphere it creates. This stops your response from drifting, and drifting is one of the biggest reasons students really underperform. Now, notice what the question asks for. It says choose 3 examples of words or phrases from each paragraph. That means 6 in total. So the cleanest way to approach this is to write 2 separate paragraphs, one for the first given paragraph and one for the second. Inside each, of course, aim for 3 strong quotations. Now, a quick word of warning: slightly over is absolutely fine. Slightly under can sometimes be okay, but if you're significantly under the word count, it usually means that ideas haven't been fully developed. Remember, this is a reading response. The marks are in the quality of your analysis and always have been. This is not about sounding fancy, guys. It's about being clear. It's about being precise and really unpicking the effect of language. And this bit is crucial. Focus on powerful words, phrases, and images. Don't just grab the first quotation you see. Choose the ones that actually do something, the words that build a vivid image, the phrases that reveal emotion, the images that create atmosphere, etc. Those are the ones that give you something to really deconstruct, because top-down responses don't just identify language, they take it apart piece by piece and explain exactly what it makes the reader see, feel, and understand, etc. So before we start properly analysing any word or image, there is one step that students often skip. And this is one of the biggest reasons I think their responses stay a little bit surface level. Now, you must start with the explicit meaning. So in other words, what does that word or phrase literally mean first? What is the clear, straightforward image or idea that the writer is presenting? Think of it as though you are climbing a ladder. You cannot jump straight to the top rung. You have to secure the lower ones first. Now, the lower rung is the explicit meaning, and only once that is secure can you climb towards that deeper analysis. For example, if the writer describes the sky as shattered glass, before we start talking about tension, danger, or I guess emotional chaos, we need to first establish the literal image. Glass, of course, is something broken, it's sharp, it's fragmented, it's difficult to put back together, if not impossible, and that is the explicit meaning. Once we've got that clear in our minds, then we can move into what it suggests. And this is where students sometimes go wrong. They leap straight into saying something vague like, this creates tension, without actually showing the examiner what the words themselves mean. Now, Cambridge wants to see that you truly understand the image before you start interpreting it. So always begin with a clear literal meaning of the word or phrase. Ask yourself, what can I actually picture? What is physically or literally being described here? Once that foundation is secure, then you can move upwards into the connotations, the symbolism, the atmosphere, and the wider effect. Think of it as building analysis step by step. Explicit meaning first, deeper interpretation second. Get that order right and your analysis instantly becomes sharper and much more convincing. And honestly, this is one of those small shifts that can really make a huge difference to the quality of your writer's effect response. So once we've secured the explicit meaning, this is where the, I guess, real analysis begins. This is where you get most of your marks from, essentially, the implicit meaning. Now, this is all about what the writer is suggesting rather than directly stating. So, in other words, what ideas, emotions, or attitudes are being hinted at beneath the surface. Now, this is where students can really start to impress Cambridge, because now we're moving beyond the obvious and into interpretation. Now, let's go back to that earlier example of shattered glass. Explicitly, we know that it gives us an image of something broken, sharp, fragmented, etc. But implicitly, what might that suggest? Well, it could suggest danger, it could suggest tension, emotional instability, depending on the context, or even something that has been violently destroyed. Now, none of these ideas, of course, are directly stated with the information I've given you, but they are strongly implied by the image. And that is exactly what implicit meaning is. It's what the reader is encouraged, I guess, to infer. Now, this is the point where your analysis starts to sound more perceptive and more sophisticated, because you are showing that you understand how language works on a deeper level, and you're showing a real appreciation of how language works. Now, a really good way to signpost this kind of analysis is through what I refer to as analytical verbs. And these very much help guide the examiner through your thinking and make your response sound clear and purposeful. For example, instead of repeatedly saying "this means," you can use verbs like "this suggests," "reveals," "emphasizes," "highlights," "foregrounds," "underlines," etc. So rather than saying the image means the character is scared, you might say the fractured image suggests the character's fear is overwhelming and difficult to control, for example. Now, straight away, that, of course, sounds far more critical, it sounds far more analytical, and that's what we want to aim for. And these verbs very much show that you are interpreting the writer's choices rather than simply retelling the text. And honestly, this is where students often start to move into those higher bands, and when they combine the explicit meaning with a thoughtful implicit interpretation. So I guess in many ways, guys, think of this as a two-step process. First, what the literal meaning is. Second, what does it suggest beneath the surface? So before we go any further, this is the first of many short activities that will be peppered throughout the course, guys. And it's really important that you pause the video and complete them on paper. Please do not skip them. As mentioned in my very lengthy introduction, this isn't a passive sit back and listen kind of video. The whole point is that you actively build the skills as we go. So each task is there for a reason, and it's there to help you build the foundation step by step, working towards a full writer's effect response later in the course. So when these activities do come up, pause the video, write your answers down properly, and then compare them with the walkthrough. For this one, I want you to focus on the words in bold and write down the explicit meanings only. In other words, what they literally mean within the context. No deeper inference just yet. We are simply securing the first rung of the ladder, that clear meaning. So you can pause the video now, work through all 5, and then come back for the answers. Right, let's check your answers. Of course, the key thing here is that we are focusing purely on the explicit meaning, what the word literally means in this context. So, of course, clutched means tightly held in her hand. So straight away, this gives us a clear image before we start thinking about what it might suggest emotionally. And next means taken over or occupied, almost as if the clothes and paper have completely claimed the space. Terminal means final or at the end, which gives us a clear sense of an end point. Residual means remaining after something has ended. So in this case, the silence is what is left behind after the bell. And finally, fading means gradually becoming less visible. Now, what I want you to notice is how simple these definitions are. At this stage, we are not trying to sound clever. We are just making sure we fully understand the literal meaning of the word first. Once that is secured, we can then start moving into the implicit meaning and the wider effect. The first step is what gives your later analysis accuracy and depth. Remember that. Now we are moving from explicit meaning into implicit meaning. We already know what clutch means on a literal level. She is holding the letter tightly. Now it's your turn to take it one step further. What does that tight grip suggest about the girl's feelings and the situation? This is where you begin making one or two inferences. Does it suggest, for example, tension, nervousness, fear, shock, something important or upsetting in the letter? I want you to complete the sentence stem on the screen. The verb clutched refers to the girl holding the letter tightly. It suggests. So pause the video now, jot down one or two clear inferences on your sheet of paper before we go through it together. Okay, so the same idea here. Now it's your turn to move into the implicit meaning. What does it suggest about the state of the room and what might be happening with the belongings? Does it, for example, suggest mess, disorder, chaos, or perhaps that things have been left in a hurry? So with that in mind, I want you to complete the sentence stem. The verb next refers to the floor being taken over by the belongings. It suggests. Pause the video now and make one or two clear inferences on paper before we check it together. Okay, with this one, we already know the explicit meaning of terminal. The light is reaching the end of the corridor. Now, I want you to think about the implicit meaning. What does that suggest about the corridor itself and the way the light is being presented? Does it suggest distance, an ending, a sense of finality, for example, or perhaps something slightly more ominous? Complete the sentence stem. The adjective terminal refers to the light reaching the end of the corridor. It suggests. And of course, pause the video now and make one or two clear inferences on paper before we go through the answer together. Now with this one, we already know the explicit meaning of residual. The silence is left behind after the bell. Now I want you to think about the implicit meaning. What does that suggest about the atmosphere in the classroom? Does it suggest an unusual stillness, tension, calm, or perhaps the lingering presence of what has just happened? Complete the sentence stem. The adjective residual refers to the silence left after the bell. It suggests. And of course, pause the video now and make one or two clear inferences on your paper before we check it together. Right, last one before we check the answers. So of course we know that the explicit meaning of fading refers to the markings becoming less visible. Now I want you to think about the implicit meaning. What does that suggest about the state of the playground and how recently it has been used maybe? Does it suggest neglect, the passage of time, or that the space has been left empty for a while? Complete the sentence stem. The adjective fading refers to the markings now being less visible. It suggests. Pause the video now and make one or two clear inferences on paper before we go through all 5 together. Okay, so let's check the suggested answers. Now, the first thing I want to say is that answers, of course, can vary. That is the nature of language analysis. This is really important. Language analysis is not a one answer only question. So as long as your inference is sensible, is rooted in the word or phrase and clearly explained, it can absolutely be valid. So for clutched, a strong inference might be anxiety and emotional dependence on the letter's contents. For annexed, we move towards ideas like loss of control and overwhelming accumulation, as though the belongings have completely taken over the space. They're absolutely strewn everywhere. For terminal, a strong idea is finality and perhaps a sense of no escape, which makes the corridor feel closed off, or as I've said before, somewhat ominous. For residual, this could suggest an atmosphere of hesitation, restraint, or maybe lingering tension rather than immediate relief after the bell. And finally, fading might suggest a loss of innocence or childhood presence as the signs of play are slowly disappearing. Now, what I really want you to notice is how each inference grows directly out of the explicit meaning. Nothing is random. We are always moving from what the word literally means into what it suggests. And that step-by-step method is what will hopefully make your analysis feel far more precise and convincing. And that brings us to the end of day 1 and our first module. Now, today was all about building the foundations, understanding the difference between explicit meaning and implicit meaning, and getting, I guess, comfortable with moving from literal definitions into clear thoughtful inferences. Now, honestly, this is one of the most important skills for the writer's effect question, because if this foundation is secure, everything we do next becomes so much easier. So make sure you keep your notes from today and revisit the activities if needed to. Now, on day 2, we're going to take this a step further by looking at how to unpick powerful images and phrases in a much more exam-focused way. That's where we really start shaping this into a kind of analysis Cambridge wants to see. Okay, if you are still alive, let's crack on with day 2 or module 2. Now, hopefully by now you should feel much clearer on the nuts and bolts, starting with the explicit meaning, then moving on to those implicit inferences. Now we're going to build on that and start unpicking powerful images and phrases in a much more exam-focused way. Now, this is where your analysis starts to feel sharper, more precise, and much closer to what Cambridge wants to see in the higher bands. So let's get straight into module 2. Right, so now that you've hopefully got a much firmer grip on explicit and implicit meaning, let's take it a step further and start unpicking powerful images. And this is where students often start to say, fingers crossed, hopefully a lot about a little. And that's exactly what strong writer's effect analysis does. It takes one striking image or phrase and really unpacks it layer by layer. Another analogy for you guys, think of it a bit like a mouth-watering cake. Your explicit meaning is the base layer that grounds your analysis and keeps it accurate. Then on top of that comes your layers of inference. And let's be honest, nobody wants a single tiered cake. Same goes for your analysis. You don't want one quick inference and then move on. You want to build upwards with at least a couple of clear developed ideas from each quotation. And that's how your response starts to feel, I guess, layered, perceptive, and much more top band. So in this module, we're going to focus on how to take a striking image and really squeeze as much meaning out of it as possible. Now, the focus for this part of module 2 is establishing the overall effect. So before we start zooming in on individual words and phrases, it's always worth asking yourself, what is the writer trying to create overall? What is, I guess, the dominant image, feeling, or atmosphere across the whole passage? So let's take a read of the passage first. That's on your screen now. The path narrowed without warning, forcing him to turn sidewards as thorns scraped along his arms, leaving heat in their weight. Mud clung to his boots, heavy and reluctant, and the ground shifted unpredictably beneath his weight. The air was thick with rot and damp heat settling in his lungs and making each breath shallow. Somewhere close, something creaked and retreated. Something cracked and retreated, unseen but unmistakably near. Light barely filtered through the canopy, staining the ground a sickly green as he moved on, alert and exposed. Now, the first thing I've done here is work out the overall effect before, of course, zooming in on individual quotations. For me, the dominant image is one of sustained physical strain and constant threat. You can see how I've arrived at that by looking at the repeated details across the passage. So the physical strain very much comes through in phrases like forcing him to turn sideways, which of course immediately suggests discomfort and restriction. Then we get mud clung to his boots, heavy and reluctant, which of course creates this sense that even the ground is working against him, making every movement more difficult. And on top of that, the air is described as thick with rot and damp heat, making each breath shallow. So even breathing feels like an effort. Then we move into this sense of constant threat. So the thorns are described as scraping along his arm. The ground shifts unpredictably, and then there's something cracking and retreating. It's unseen but unmistakably near. Now, the last detail is especially effective because the danger is close but not visible, which creates this sort of palpable tension and unease. So rather than choosing a random phrase, I've taken, I guess, the recurring ideas across the whole passage. There's struggle, discomfort, there's danger, and I've turned that into a clear overall effect statement, which is as follows. in the red on your screen. The overall effect of the language creates an image of the journey through the jungle being one of sustained physical strain and constant threat. Now this gives the rest of the paragraph a clear focus too, because every quotation we choose from here should now help prove that bigger idea. Hopefully that makes sense. Now it's your turn. I want you to read through this passage carefully and work out the overall effect for yourself. Before we start zooming in on individual quotations, I want you to ask yourself, what is the dominant image, feeling or atmosphere being created across the whole extract? Is it danger, isolation, maybe vulnerability, suspense, etc.? Use the following sentence stem. The overall effect of the language creates an image of, and complete it in your own words. Remember, you're not zooming in on single words just yet, or phrases or images. You're just looking at the passage as a whole and identifying the bigger picture. Pause the video now, jot down your answer on paper, and then we'll compare it with my sentence. So the overall effect I've gone for is the overall effect of the language creates an image of the sea as unstable and quietly threatening, making the experience feel tense, isolating, and unsettling. And let me just show you how I got there. Well, the first word that really stands out is flattened. On the surface, that sounds quite calm, I guess, but it's immediately followed by smooth but tense, which creates this uneasy contrast. The sea, of course, it does look still, yet it feels as though something is about to happen, and that's where this sense of instability starts. Then we get the board rocking beneath him without warning. Now that phrase without warning is key because it suggests unpredictability. He has no control over what the sea is doing, which of course immediately creates tension. And this sense of isolation comes through in finding nothing solid to rest on. He is, of course, surrounded by water with nothing stable or safe, which makes the experience feel quite vulnerable and alone. Then the threat becomes quieter and I guess in many ways more psychological. Now, something brushed past his leg light and quick before disappearing. We never fully see what it is, and that uncertainty is what makes it unsettling. The danger is implied rather than directly stated. And finally, the water becomes suddenly very still. Again, stillness here doesn't feel necessarily peaceful. It feels ominous, it feels foreboding. It's almost like the calm before the storm. So when I put those repeated ideas together, when I stitch them all together in my mind, unpredictability, lack of control, isolation, and unseen danger, that leads me to the overall effect of the sea feeling unstable and quietly threatening. Now it's your turn again. Using the same approach as before, I want you to read through the passage independently and work out the overall effect of the language. Think about the dominant image, feeling, or atmosphere, and what the writer is creating across the whole extract. And of course, use the sentence stem, the overall effect of the language creates an image of, and complete it in your own words. Remember, at this stage, we are still looking at the bigger picture, not zooming in on individual words just yet. Pause the video now, jot down your overall effect statement on paper, and then we'll compare it with my model sentence opener. So the overall effect I've gone for is the overall effect of the language creates an image of the market stall as lively and energetic, but unstable and chaotic. And by the way, guys, Cambridge loves contrast, FYI. And let me show you how I've got to there. So the first thing I'm doing is looking for, again, the repeated images running through the whole passage rather than jumping straight into one quotation. I guess the sense of the stall being lively and energetic comes from the movement and the noise across the extract. There's likely a lot of activity, people moving, objects being handled, and details that suggest a busy, fast-paced environment. And that repeated movement creates an atmosphere of, I guess, energy and life. However, alongside that, there's also a clear sense of instability and chaos. And this usually comes through in language that suggests things are, I guess, unsteady, unpredictable, or difficult to control. Perhaps items shifting, voices overlapping, objects piling up, or the scene feeling crowded and slightly overwhelming. So rather than choosing one word, I'm taking the overall mood created by repeated details and turning that into a focused statement. The important thing to notice is the contrast word but. and that helps show the, I guess, the duality of the image. Yes, the stall is vibrant and full of life, but it also feels, I guess, messy, unstable, and perhaps on the edge of disorder. And that contrast is often what makes an overall effect statement sound perceptive and precise. So now we are moving on to selecting your images. And at this stage, I'm not asking you to analyze anything just yet. All I want you to do is identify 3 powerful words, phrases, or images from the passage that you think would give you something to say. You don't need to print anything out, just jot them down on paper. The key here is selection. Choose images where you are confident you understand the vocabulary and where you can already sense some, I guess, meaning or effect. Don't guess, and don't just pick the longest phrase. Pick the ones that feel striking, vivid, full of movement, etc. Now pause the video now and jot down your 3 choices, because this is the first step before we move on to the next skill. Now what you're seeing on your screen are the 3 images I've selected, but it's really important to say that others are absolutely possible. This is not a one answer only question. So as long as the images you choose are powerful, clear, and give you something to analyze, there's some meat on the bone, they can absolutely be valid choices. Now I've gone for slipped and knocked, bursting under a hill, and brief flashes of silver swallowed by moving hands. And what I like about these is that each one gives us something slightly different to work with. The first 2 immediately create movement and instability, whilst that final image gives us something more visual and layered. So don't panic if your choices are slightly different. What matters is whether you can say something meaningful about them. Selection is the first skill, analysis is the next. Okay guys, what you're seeing on your screens now initially might seem slightly overwhelming, but just take a look at how I've annotated the explicit meanings here, because this is the first rung of the ladder. Now, of course, in the exam you probably, you won't have time to write out the full explicit and implicit annotations like this, and that's absolutely fine. This is more of a visual guide to help you see the thought process. However, what you should be doing in your exam is making quick, rough annotations next to the powerful words and phrases you selected, just enough to capture, I guess, the clear literal meaning and something brief about the implicit meaning as well. For example, slipped and knocked tells us that the oranges moved out of place and bumped into one another at the edge of the table. Bursting under a hill gives us a clear image of something being crushed and split open, and brief flashes of silver swallowed by moving hands suggest quick glints from the coins before they disappear from view. Now these annotations don't need to be long, a few words is perfectly fine. The important thing is that we always start with the explicit meaning of the powerful words before moving on to what they suggest, and this very much is the foundation of what makes the deeper analysis much easier. Now take a look at how I've annotated the implicit meanings, because this is where we move up to the next rung of the ladder and start talking about what the language suggests. Again, in the exam, it doesn't need to be neat or written out fully like this. These are just visual model annotations, so you can see my thinking clearly. Now, once we've secured the explicit meaning, we then ask ourselves, what does this reveal about the overall image and atmosphere? For example, with slipped and knocked, the annotation no longer tells us what the oranges are doing. It begins to suggest a sense of disorder and instability, as if the stall is difficult to control. Bursting under a hill pushes that further, suggesting pressure, damage, and chaotic movement of people around the stall. Then brief flashes of silver swallowed by moving hands. It's a really powerful image and quite a mouthful to say. The phrase moving hands suggests hurried grabbing, which hints at, I guess, competition, urgency, and even possible greed, whilst that verb swallow creates this impression that the coins disappear almost instantly from sight. And this is exactly what strong writer's effect analysis does. It starts with what the words mean, then move on to what they suggest about the bigger picture. And this is how we begin building that overall image of the market stall as lively, energetic, but also unstable and chaotic. So this is where we are going to start bringing everything together into something that actually starts to resemble a writer's effect paragraph. Just a quick note, this is just a basic writing frame for now. Later in the course, when we move on to the actual writer's effect question, we'll adapt this into a much sharper exam style paragraph. But at this stage, we're dipping our toes in the water, and the aim is simple. Let's take the ideas from the previous slides and slot them into a clear structure. So if you've done the activities, you've already identified the powerful images, you've already worked out the explicit meanings, you've already explored what those images suggest. Now all you need to do is drop those ideas into the blank so that you begin building a response that kind of resembles a full paragraph. Now think of this as, again, dipping your toes into the water before we dive into the full question. For the first one, you might start with slipped and knocked, for example, then use your explicit meaning, what it literally refers to, followed by your inference about disorder and instability or whatever other ideas you have. Then do exactly the same with your second and third images. The key thing here is that you are starting to see the pattern. Quote, explicit meaning, implicit meaning, and that structure really is the backbone of strong language analysis. And once this becomes natural, writing full paragraphs becomes so much easier, I promise you. So that brings us to the end of day 2. Module 2 is complete. Now today has been about moving simply from spotting good quotations to actually unpicking them with purpose. We started with thinking about the overall effect. What is the writer trying to make the reader picture or feel before zooming into individual words and images? From there, we practiced selecting powerful phrases, breaking them down through the explicit meaning first, and then climbing to that next rung by exploring the implicit meaning and inferences. And of course, most importantly, you've now started shaping those ideas into a basic writer's effect paragraph structure. Quote, explicit meaning, then what it suggests. Now this is a huge step forward because this is where your analysis stops being, I guess, random comments and words and starts becoming a clear, controlled response. So in the next module, we're going to take this even further and focus on how to structure a proper exam style writer's effect response. So everything starts to look exactly like what Cambridge wants to see. For now, make sure you've got today's notes down, especially that quote, explicit, implicit structure, because we're going to build directly onto it next. Excellent work. Let's move on to module 3. Okay, so let's take a moment to breathe and let's crack on with day 3, module 3, how to structure your response. Now, up to this point, we've done the hard thinking. You now know how to identify powerful images, work out explicit meaning, and push into the implicit meaning and the overall effect. Now it's time to turn all of that into something that actually looks like a top band writer's effect answer. Now this module is all about structure and control. So in this next section, I'm going to show you exactly how to build your paragraph step by step so the examiner can follow your thinking with ease. And this, fingers crossed, is where everything starts to hopefully come together. So let's focus on how to organize those ideas into a clear, repeatable structure. Now, just a really important reminder before we start, this is a reading response. So that means there are absolutely no marks for writing accuracy. However, in the same breath, you do want your ideas and your paragraphs to be as coherent and easy to follow as can be. However, if you're worrying about sounding beautifully literary or writing the world's most elegant sentence, don't. What matters here is the clarity of analysis. That said, a strong structure is absolutely vital because it stops you missing key steps and helps the examiner follow your thinking. Now, on the right, I've given you my 10 steps to success. So this really easy, repeatable structure. This is the exact structure I use with my students and the exact structure I strongly recommend because it forces you to move logically through the response. So starting with the overall effect, then your first image, its explicit meaning, what it suggests, and then you repeat that same pattern for your second and third images. And it works every single time because it keeps your analysis focused and layered. So think of it almost like a formula. Overall effect, quote, explicit, implicit, repeat, repeat, repeat. Now let's put that structure into action and do one together. So take a moment to read the short extract on the left, and as you read it, don't worry about individual quotations just yet. The focus for now is step 1, the overall effect. ask yourself, what is the bigger image the writer is creating here? And before we zoom in, what is the reader made to picture and feel? We've got phrases like churned like a trapped current, we've got uneven waves, narrowed and widened without warning, and invisible pressure. Now straight away that creates an image of movement that feels unpredictable, pressured and difficult to control. So this is where I want you to pause the video and have a go at writing your own sentence opener using the frame, the overall effect the language creates an image of. Try to keep it broad and focus on the big picture, not individual word analysis yet. For example, you might begin moving towards something like an image of the shopping centre as chaotic and overwhelming, with people being controlled by the movement around them. Pause it here and have a go. So this is my example. So now let's dissect it together and see exactly why it works. So my overall effect sentence is as follows. The overall effect of the language creates an image of the shopping centre as overwhelming and disorientating. And let's break that down. So first I've included the subject of the image, the shopping centre. This is really important because it immediately tells the examiner what the paragraph is going to focus on. Then I've chosen two carefully selected adjectives: overwhelming, disorientating. These of course aren't random, they come directly from the extract. For example, the phrase "people swept along in uneven waves" suggests movement that feels uncontrollable, almost as if people are being carried by a force bigger than themselves. And that helps create this sense of the shopping centre being overwhelming. Then we have corridors narrowed and widened without warning, and sharp turns, and those details make the space feel, I guess, confusing and unpredictable, which is exactly where disorientating comes from. So what I want you to notice is that this opening sentence is not vague. It is built directly from the evidence in the passage and gives the paragraph a clear direction. Now, every quotation we analyse moving forward next should link back to proving those two ideas. Now that we've established the overall effect, the next step is to choose our three strongest images. Now remember, the writer's effect question wants 3 powerful words or phrases per paragraph, so we need to be selective. Here I've highlighted 3 really strong choices. So I've selected churned like a trapped current, sudden stops and sharp turns, towering signs loomed, and flickered. Let's model the first one together. So for the explicit meaning, I've written the shopping centre is very busy and chaotic, with people moving constantly and tightly packed together. That's the literal image, lots of movement, lots of bodies, very little control. Then we move to the implicit meaning, so people very much feel trapped, they feel powerless, they're swept along without control, and this is where we connect it back to our overall effect. So the simile, like a trapped current, suggests people are not moving freely, they are being pushed by the environment around them, and that links beautifully to our opening idea of the shopping centre being overwhelming and disorientating. Now it's your turn to apply the same process to the last 2 images. Try annotating both the explicit meaning first, then the implicit suggestion underneath. So this is the moment where we put everything together into a full paragraph. So up until now, we've broken the process down into manageable steps. So the overall effect, image selection, explicit meaning, then inference. Now I want you to have a go at writing the full writer's effect paragraph yourself. Just one, using this 10-step structure. Use the sentence starters on the screen to help guide you through it. Now start with the overall effect sentence, then work through your 3 chosen images, making sure you explain both the literal meaning and what each one suggests. Now don't worry about making it sound overly sophisticated at this stage. The goal here is to build the habit and, I guess, the structure. Now think of this as assembling the paragraph piece by piece. And if you find yourself getting stuck, don't panic. The next slide will give you some help in the form of a full model response, so you can compare your own paragraph and see exactly how it should all come together. So pause the video here, give it a proper go, then move on to the next slide if you need support. Now don't let this model throw you off. If you've read it and you've dissected it to death, you might be looking at it thinking, hang on, this doesn't follow the writing frame word for word, and you'd be absolutely right. That's because the writing frame is there to teach the basic structure. This model shows you what the structure can start to look like once it becomes a little more natural and a little more developed.
But here is the really important thing. When you have a longer image, you should not just lump the whole thing together and make one vague comment on it. You need to really unpick it. In other words, break the image into parts that are doing the work and think carefully about how each part contributes to the overall effect. Take the final example, towering signs loomed and flickered. If I just treated that as one big chunk and said this creates a negative atmosphere, that would be far too general. Instead, I've separated it out. So towering and loomed help create a sense of size, dominance and threat, as if the signs are hanging over people in an oppressive way. Then flickered adds something slightly different. It suggests instability, unreliability, and unease because the light is not steady or comforting. So rather than lumping the whole image together, I'm unpicking different parts and thinking about how they work together. That is the really important bit.
And that, guys, brings us to the end of day 3, how to structure your response. I hope that by now you should be feeling much clearer about how to actually build a writer's effect paragraph from start to finish. We've gone from simply spotting powerful images to now turning them into a clear, structured, analytical response. Now just remember, the magic is in the process. Start with the overall effect, zoom in on your chosen image, explain the explicit meaning, then move into what the writer is really suggesting. And as we've seen today, if an image is longer, don't lump it all together. Cambridge absolutely hate it. Try and unpick it, zoom in more than once, think carefully about how each word or how each phrase works together to create the bigger effect. And I promise you guys, that is what starts to lift your response into those top band territories. The structure I've shown you works every single time. And once it becomes, I guess, second nature, writing these paragraphs becomes so much quicker and so much less intimidating. So that's day 3 complete. Massive well done. One more module to go. Okay, if you are still with me, firstly, massive respect. We have officially made it to the final module, module 4. Oh, and if you've made it this far, type "I made it out alive" in the comments. Okay, day 4, the final push. So at this point, you've already done the heavy lifting. You now understand what language analysis actually is, how to unpick powerful images, and most importantly, how to structure a response that actually works in the exam. So today, of course, is all about one thing: what success actually looks like. This is where everything we've built over the last 3 modules comes together. No more isolated skills, no more sentence frames, no more training wheels. We're now looking at what a strong, polished writer's effect response should look like when it's all finally put together. And this is the bit students often need most, not just knowing what to do, but seeing what a top response looks like, feels like. So in this final module, we're going to bring everything together and make sure that when you walk into that exam, you know exactly what success looks like. Final module, let's finish strong.
So we've already looked at my steps to success structure. You know exactly how I want you to build these paragraphs. Now it's time to apply that structure to the real thing, an actual IGCSE first language English past paper question. Now, of course, this is where we move from practice mode to exam mode. Now, quick practical tip before we begin. If you have access to a printer, it would be really useful to print out text C. Honestly, this will make the whole process so much easier. That way you can highlight the powerful words and phrases, jot down quick explicit meanings, and annotate your inferences around the extract as we go. And of course, sometimes physically seeing the text in front of you and making brief notes helps the analysis click much more clearly. Now, if you don't have a printer, absolutely fine. Just keep a notebook or a spare piece of paper next to you and jot down the key images as we work through them. The important thing is that you are actively engaging with the text, not just passively watching. So we're going to apply everything we've built over the last 3 modules to a real exam style response. And this is where, fingers crossed, success starts to feel real. So let's take a read of the question together. Reread paragraphs 2 and 8. Paragraph 2 begins after breakfast and is about the view as the walkers set off. Paragraph 8 begins his initial shocked reaction and is about the village and what happened in the workshop. And then the usual wording, explain how the writer uses language to convey meaning and to create effect in these paragraphs. Choose 3 examples or words or phrases from each paragraph to support your answer. Your choices should include the use of imagery. Write about 200 to 300 words. Up to 15 marks are available for the content of your answer. Now it might be a really good time to cast your mind back to module 1, the nuts and bolts. Remember that slide when we broke the question down and annotated exactly what it was asking us to do? This is why that matters. Before we even touch the extract, we need to be crystal clear on the task. So here the question is telling us exactly where to look, so paragraphs 2 and 8. It is also reminding us that we need 3 examples from each paragraph and that our choices should include imagery. That means we are not randomly selecting quotations, we are selecting powerful words and phrases that create a clear effect. It also tells us the word count, roughly 200 to 300 words, and importantly that this is worth up to 15 marks for content. So before we move on, always take a few seconds to mentally break the question down. What is it asking me to analyze? How many quotations do I need? How many paragraphs? What specific guidance has it given me? And that little habit will save you so many marks, not just for this question, but knowing how to navigate all of the questions from paper 1 and paper 2 and any exam paper that you have to sit. You need to know the nuts and bolts. So let's take a read. Text C. After an overnight stay in a lonely farmhouse, 3 friends set off on a walk that has a mysterious ending, and this text C is titled An Unexplained Disappearance. Next morning, the 3 friends sat at the long table enjoying Mrs. Grace's farmhouse breakfast. Arthur Hiller, the historian, joked about the loneliness of the location. Anita Myborg, is that? Sorry if I butchered her name. The naturalist hoped to watch the rare birds of prey. Grant Frensham, gosh, all of these names, loved tramping across the moors. Mrs. Grace glanced at their map. I hope you wouldn't be thinking of going into Malborough. That's a bad village. No one's gone there since a young man got locked up overnight. They say that it's full of dangerous animals, and around it there's what we call a wild forest, a terrible place with sudden deep waters and paths that lead you to nowhere and trap you. Just keep right and skirt that village and the forest. After breakfast, the 3 walkers set off in high spirits, marvelling at the view before them. Hiller likened it to the work of a famous painter. The track they took up wound up the hill like a shiny yellow ribbon tapering from their view until the forest finally swallowed it up. To their left the land fell away suddenly like a cliff face, with tiny sheep on the valley resembling white patches, Anita said. Beyond stood lines of grey hills like uniformed guards. Halfway up the hill was a stone hut that figured on their map, and beyond was a small circle of trees that would serve as a bird-watching hide. Anita said, "Go on, I'll catch up later. This is just the right place for eagles." She was holding a pair of powerful binoculars. 10 minutes later, Frensham and Hiller reached the summit and entered the woodland they had seen at the beginning of their walk. Soon the track divided into 2 and a signpost pointed out to Malborough. Hiller frowned, unsure of himself. Then he said, "I think we should go and investigate. As a historian, I'd like to set the record straight about this place." Frensham said, "You heard what Mrs. Grace said about those strangers that go up and down the track and the lights in the sky at night. I think she believes in UFOs, but it's dangerous nonetheless." Hiller was a fiery man. In a moment he began to argue, and a fierce disagreement broke out between them. Frensham lost his temper too and turned his back on Hiller. He set off alongside the right-hand path, passing a high wire fence and hearing what he thought was an occasional gunshot. He walked far that day, meeting only one other rambler, and returned to the farmhouse late in the afternoon. There he found Anita, who had spent her time watching eagles and had not tried to rejoin the 2 men. Of Hiller there was no sign. Eventually they called in the local police officer, who seemed unhelpful, but who questioned Frensham closely for nearly an hour. As Hiller approached Malborough village, he sensed something was wrong. There were the remains of barbed wire strewn on the ground, and at one point the path was virtually blocked. He had come so far that he declined to turn back, and curiosity got the better of him. He waited to see whether Frensham had relented and followed him. Then, impatient and wanting to get on, he entered the village. His initial shock reaction was that there had been a catastrophic earthquake. The houses, where they remained intact, were nothing but shells. On closer inspection he saw that the holes were pockmarked with tiny bullet holes. Then he wondered whether the place had been created as a ruin, maybe a film set. Before him was what seemed to be a workshop, with a door that hung off its hinges and creaked in the wind as if in a ghost town. He entered cautiously, and immediately 2 grotesque figures with wild expressions and wearing army gear lunged at him. They rattled and roared as hinges and levers swiveled, swinging backwards and forwards in a vast jangling of unrestrained metal. Hiller, frightened, flung himself to the floor, then allowing himself to look at this terrible sight, he saw that they were nothing but mechanical figures, and it dawned on him that he had stumbled across some secret military installation. He rushed outside, his face contorted with alarm, and collapsed into a low stone wall. All was silence once more, but for a moment he seemed to see faces peering out of the windowless houses, and what looked like an officer's peaked cap. Fear deprived him of his senses, and in a blind panic he ran out of the village and into the terrible depths of the wild forest, watched by 2 silent men in uniform. Gosh, that's quite an ominous story. So now that we've read the passage together, here is the first paragraph the question directs us to. So this is paragraph 2, the section which focuses on the view as the walkers set off. Now, before we start writing anything, we do what strong students always do first. We annotate briefly. I want you to look carefully through this paragraph and begin selecting 3 powerful words or phrases that really stand out. Remember, the question is asking us to explain how the writer uses language to create effect, so we are hunting for phrases that do exactly that. Look for comparisons, striking descriptions, and any imagery that helps create a clear picture in your mind. You might already be spotting phrases like shiny yellow ribbon, the forest finally swallowed it up, and uniformed guards. Those are the kind of images we want. At this stage, don't overcomplicate it. Highlight them, underline them, or drop them down roughly, then begin making quick annotations. What does this phrase literally mean? And what do these words, images, phrases suggest? Now let's move on to the second paragraph the question asks us to analyse, and that's paragraph 8. Now straight away you should notice how different the atmosphere feels compared to the first one. The first paragraph was all about the view, the landscape, I guess the beauty of the walkers setting off. This one is much darker, much more unsettling. Again, before we start writing anything, we annotate first. I want you to scan through the paragraph and pick out 3 really powerful images or phrases. Look for the words doing the heavy lifting. For example, you might be drawn to phrases such as nothing but shells, pot marked with tiny bullet holes, ghost town, the vast jangling of unrestrained metal, etc. It's a slightly larger paragraph, though it is very dense in terms of the images that you could select. But these are exactly the kind of images that create strong effects. At this point, begin asking yourself, what does it literally mean? What does it suggest? Right, let's compare your annotations with mine, and don't panic if yours don't look identical. Remember, there is never just one correct set of images in writer's effect. What matters is that your choices are powerful, clearly understood, and linked to the overall effect. So let's unpick mine. So first I've selected shiny yellow ribbon. Now notice I haven't just said nice path and moved on, I've broken it down carefully. So the explicit meaning is that the track is long, it's narrow, it's smooth, bright, clearly visible, etc. Then we move up the ladder into the implicit meaning. So it suggests the path maybe feels safe, inviting, easy to follow, which maybe creates a false sense of security. And that last bit is really important. I'm already thinking about how this image works with the rest of the paragraph. Next, look at forest swallowed it up. This is a brilliant image. So of course, explicitly the forest completely covers and hides the track, but implicitly this begins to suggest danger, uncertainty, and the possibility of being trapped or losing direction. Now see how the mood is already starting to shift. That's why we must think really carefully about how the images work together, not just separately. The path does feel safe, then suddenly disappears, and that contrast is doing a lot of work. And finally, I've chosen grey hills like uniformed guards. Now, explicitly, the hills are lined up in, I guess, this rigid military-like formation, but implicitly, this creates ideas of surveillance, control, restriction, hidden danger. It's almost like they're being watched. And that's a key idea I want you to notice. Individual images matter, but the overall effect comes from how they combine. A welcoming path, a track that disappears, hills that seem to stand guard, and together they create an atmosphere that shifts from calm beauty to quiet unease. And that's exactly the kind of thinking that examiners love. Right, now let's compare this second paragraph with my model annotations. So straight away, notice how the atmosphere here is completely different from the first paragraph. The first one moved from beauty to unease. This one throws us straight into fear, it throws into danger and shock. So let's break it down. So first I've chosen pot marked with tiny bullet holes. Now explicitly this means the walls were very much covered with lots of small impact marks made by bullets. Now move into the implicit meaning. This immediately is suggesting violence, it's suggesting weapons, conflict, military activity, and it tells us that this place is by no means normal. It feels dangerous before anything has even jumped out at him. And already the writer is planting fear. Next, look at creaked in the wind as if in a ghost town. This is a lovely one to analyze because the image does so much work. So explicitly the door is making a long, low noise as it moves in the wind, but implicitly this suggests eerie abandonment, silence, it suggests unease, and that phrase ghost town pushes the image even further. It creates a sense of emptiness and desolation, as if something terrible has happened here. Then we get two grotesque figures lunging at him. This is brilliant for building tension. Now, of course, explicitly two frightening, distorted figures suddenly rush towards him. Implicitly, this suggests a sudden, overwhelming threat and total loss of control. Now, notice the verb lunge. That one word creates speed, it creates violence, it creates aggression. It makes the moment feel immediate and terrifying. And again, just like my previous paragraph, I want you to think about how the images work together. We've got bullet holes, ghost town, silence, figures lunging out. Together the writer builds an atmosphere of shock, danger, this almost horror-like suspense. And this is exactly why we must never treat each image as separate little boxes, I guess. The overall effect comes from how each one layers on top of the previous one, and by the end the reader feels just as alarmed and disorientated as Arthur. Right, over to you now. Your task is to write two fully developed writer's effect paragraphs, one for each paragraph we've just annotated, and this time no help, no sentence starters, no writing frame, no model on screen. Just you, the text, your annotations, and the structure we've built over the last few days. I want you to pause the video now and give this a proper go. Aim to spend around 30 to 35 minutes writing your response. That's a really sensible amount of time because in the real exam you'll need to work efficiently and keep the response nice and controlled. Remember what we've practiced. Start with the overall effect, select 3 powerful images, explain the explicit meaning, then push into the implicit meaning, and always think about how the images work together to shape the atmosphere. Good luck. Right, welcome back. Here's my first model response for paragraph 2, and let's read it together. The overall effect of the language creates an image of a deceptively beautiful landscape that draws the walkers in before revealing its danger. Firstly, the writer describes the hill being like a shiny yellow ribbon. The imagery refers to the track being long, narrow, smooth and bright in colour. Additionally, it suggests the path looks attractive and easy to follow. It may also be lulling the walkers into a false sense of security, making the journey seem safe at first. Secondly, the writer describes that their view was soon swallowed up by the forest. The verb swallow refers to the forest completely covering and hiding the path from view. Furthermore, it suggests danger and the risk of losing direction. It may also imply the walkers could become trapped or unable to find their way back. Lastly, the writer describes the hills being likened to uniformed ghosts. The imagery refers to the hills lined up in rigid military-like formation. Moreover, it suggests the walkers are being watched and that their movement is controlled or restricted by the landscape. Now, what I really want you to do here is compare the quality of the thinking and the structure. Ask yourself, did I begin with a clear overall effect? Did I choose 3 powerful images? Did I move from explicit meaning into implicit? And most importantly, did I explain how the images work together? Now, notice how I begin with the overall effect of the language creates an image of a deceptively beautiful landscape that draws the walkers in before revealing its danger. That sentence is doing a lot there. It gives the subject, the mood, the shift in atmosphere. That's exactly what a strong opener should do, if appropriate for the text that you have been given. then look at how I move through each image. I don't rush, I zoom in carefully. For shiny yellow ribbon, I start with the explicit meaning, the path is long, narrow, smooth and bright. Then I move upwards into the implicit meaning, it feels attractive and easy to follow, creating this false sense of security. Now that phrase is really important because it links directly to the overall effect. Then with swallowed up, I focus on the verb. Notice I'm not just saying the forest hides the path. I zoom in on one keyword and that's often more powerful. Then I build the inference from that. Danger, loss of direction, possible entrapment. Finally, look at uniform guards. Again, explicit first, the hills are lined up in this rigid military formation. Then the implicit meaning pushes further, surveillance, control, restriction. And this is the last key bit I really want you to notice. The paragraph moves as a whole from beauty to threat. And that's what makes it feel coherent. It's not just 3 random language points, it's one developed overall effect. So compare yours carefully. Have you explained enough? Have you zoomed in enough? Have you pushed your inferences far enough? If not, this is the perfect time to improve it. Now let's take a read of the second paragraph. So the overall effect of the language creates an image of a terrifying war-damaged place hiding dangerous military secrets. Firstly, the writer describes that the walls were pockmarked with tiny bullet holes. The verb pockmarked refers to the surface being covered with many small dents caused by repeated gunshots. Additionally, it suggests violence and weapon use. It also implies the area is dangerous and connected to military activity. Secondly, the writer describes that the door creaked in the wind as if in a ghost town. The verb creaked refers to the door making a long, low, harsh noise, as if it moves in the wind, whilst the phrase ghost town refers to the place feeling completely empty and abandoned. Furthermore, it suggests an eerie, unsettling atmosphere and implies the village has been left behind and forgotten. Lastly, the writer describes that 2 grotesque figures lunged at him. The adjective grotesque refers to the figures looking extremely distorted and unnatural in appearance, whilst the verb lunge refers to them moving suddenly and aggressively. Moreover, it suggests sudden, overwhelming threat and a loss of control. Now, this one is brilliant to compare because the atmosphere here is much darker and far more threatening. So let's break this one down together. So notice how the opening sentence immediately captures the overall effect. So I've gone with the overall effect of the language creates an image of a terrifying war-damaged place hiding dangerous military secrets. That is precise. It tells the examiner exactly what the paragraph feels like. Then we move into the first image, so pockmarked with tiny bullet holes. Notice how I zoom in on the verb pockmarked. That's a really strong analytical move. I don't just explain the whole phrase in one lump, I isolate the key word. Now, of course, explicitly it means the surface is covered with many small dents caused by repeated gunshots. Then I move into the inference, so violence, weapons, conflict, military activity, etc. And this is where the marks are truly won. Now, looking at the second image, this is a great example of zooming in multiple times. I focus on creaked and ghost town, and this is exactly why I use that word whilst. I'm linking more than one explicit idea together. Now, the verb creaked gives us that harsh, low, eerie sound, whilst the phrase ghost town develops this sense of emptiness and abandonment. And that's a really useful sentence structure for you to borrow when analysing longer images, not lumping everything together, not treating it as one vague quotation, but carefully unpicking how each word works together to build the effect. And that point is so important, especially with longer phrases. We must dissect rather than lump everything together. Then finally, 2 grotesque figures lunged at him. Again, notice the double zoom. The adjective grotesque gives the appearance, the verb lunge gives the movement. Together those create fear, aggression and sudden threat, and that is what makes the image powerful. And that final sentence I've used, moreover it suggests sudden, overwhelming threat and a loss of control, ties everything back to the overall effect, and that's what makes the paragraph feel cohesive. So as you compare yours, ask yourself, have I zoomed in enough? Have I separated longer images carefully? Have I explained how the words work together? Because that's what pushes a response into higher bands. Okay, so let's mark this quickly. I've ticked the explicit meanings in green and the implicit meanings in orange. This is exactly where the marks are being picked up. Now notice how each quotation has been followed by a clear explanation of what it literally means. Then it's pushed further into what it suggests. And that balance is really important. This is what strong analysis really does look like, guys. So it's not just about spotting quotations or feature spotting, but clearly moving from explicit to implicit meaning every single time. Now, if your paragraph is doing this consistently, you are absolutely moving into higher bands. And exactly the same idea for paragraph 8. Green ticks show the explicit meaning, orange ticks show the implicit meanings and deeper inferences. And this is where the marks are coming from. Also notice how the analysis keeps moving from what the language literally shows to what it suggests about danger, fear and atmosphere. And that consistent movement from explicit to implicit, if it's not clear yet, is what is going to lift your response into top band territory. And who doesn't want top band territory, right?
And so that brings us to the end of my first final push course for the writer's effect question. Whew. I just want to say a huge thank you for supporting IGCSE success and I guess just trusting me to help you guide you through one of the trickiest questions on the paper. If you've made it all the way to the end of this course, genuinely well done. That is already telling me that you are putting in the kind of focused practice that really will and does make a difference. Remember, writer's effect is not about sounding fancy. It's about clear thinking, precise analysis, and moving confidently from explicit to implicit meaning. Keep practicing that process and you'll be in a really strong position for exam day. And of course, if you have any feedback or if any of you eagle-eyed legends spot a glaring error, because yes, I am only human, please do drop me an email. I always love hearing from you, and most importantly, good luck. Please do go into that exam knowing you have a structure that works and a method you can trust. And that's all for today, guys. Until next time, bye-bye.